Well, our speaker this morning is one of those folks that, you hear people say, oh, they need no introduction. Well, this morning that's really true, that this person really doesn't need an introduction. There's someone that's known to you as state board members. They're known to some of the educators that have joined us. But Dr. Pedro Noguera is with us this morning, and Pedro is the Distinguished Professor of Education at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. And his research focuses on ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by the demographic trends in local, regional, and global texts. And if you want to know more about Pedro, you can go to our program. It tells you everything down to what he had for breakfast this morning. So nonetheless, Pedro, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it so very much, and we look forward to your time with us this morning.
Thank you. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here in Atlanta with you, and I want to thank NASBE for the invitation. I was once an elected school board member myself, local board member in Berkeley, California, so I identify with people who serve. I didn't particularly like it myself. I came about a month after being elected. I came to regard as my sentence on the school board. And that was mostly because I learned quickly we weren't able to do a lot to change and improve things from the board. I started to think we were just barely managing to maintain a status quo that didn't work for most kids. And that was a source of great frustration. We were cutting budgets all the time. We had great needs that we knew we weren't meeting. And then on top of that, we were getting blamed. And when you're on a school board, they know where you live. And you run into them in the supermarket, and they'll let you know what they think. So I want to give all of you who do this work acknowledge how important it is. I know that you do it often at the expense of your own families and even sometimes your own careers, and so I want to applaud you for that service. I was in Colorado yesterday, listened to a report. They can't fill many school board offices, and many times people run unopposed. And that's a problem because, as we know, public education is the key to any democracy. And when you don't have people willing to serve in these roles to manage our schools, then the schools are in trouble. So again, thank you for your service. And thank you for the chance to speak to you this morning. I'm going to say some things that I hope will shake you up, even if they may also disturb you. I think that's my job. So let me start. I get to travel the country. Is it possible for me to see what I'm looking at, or is that impossible? So that I can see what I'm showing you. So I was in Alaska recently. It was in Anchorage. Invited to speak to all the principals across the state, and the commissioner of education delivered remarks that afternoon. And one of the things he said I thought was shocking, shocking in its honesty. He said, we do not know how to educate Alaskan Native children. And he said the data speaks for itself. Throughout the state, Alaskan Native children are not being educated, and there's a crisis. And over the course of the 2 days I was there, I was hearing about the crisis. A crisis that shows up in high suicide rates amongst juveniles, in schools that don't function, in kids who are barely coming, and they can't get educators to go serve, and it's hard up there in the Arctic North. So on many dimensions. And I was talking to one of the principals who himself was an Alaska Native. I said, and he was describing the difficulties. I said, how come, I mean, we're talking about people that have lived here for centuries. These are new problems. They haven't always been there. He said, you're right. The problem of educating our kids is a new problem. The problem of suicide amongst Alaska Natives, that's a new problem. Hasn't always been there. I got a call yesterday about Jackson, Mississippi. The state's about to take over Jackson, Mississippi schools. And the governor's decided instead to work with local leaders on a plan to try to turn it around. And they've consulting with me to say, would you work with us? I'd be happy to work with you in Jackson. I said, but are you willing to confront the issues in Jackson? That's my question. And the person who contacted me, I'm not sure if they are. What are the issues in Jackson? They're not unlike the issues in the Arctic North, believe it or not. In fact, they're the same issues you see throughout America today. That is that we have focused on the wrong things in the names of policy. We focused on standards and accountability, and we ignore the basic needs of our kids. And what does the data show? The data shows the kids with the greatest needs are the kids who do least well. And in the schools where those kids are concentrated, there's almost always failure. Almost always. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because when there's not failure, we should be paying attention. And we should be learning. But we don't. And part of the problem is that we think that we can pressure schools into improvement, that we can simply threaten people. Right? So we're going to threaten to take over Jackson. Fortunately, the governor of Mississippi said, I don't want that. Maybe he looked at what's happened in other states where there's been state takeovers. In New Jersey, every urban district, with the exception of Elizabeth, was under state control until recently. Newark just got away. Not because they're a great district now, because it's not as though state intervention results in improvement. Name to me the state that's taken over a district, and you can say afterwards, that district is doing fine now, thanks to state intervention. All right? It's a farce. And until we name it as such, we'll continue to perpetuate the farce into believing that you can pressure schools into improvement. I was in Florida visiting Edison High School, a school that is a triple F school. Not anymore. They said it's improved. So this was several years ago. And I asked the principal, how do you get to be a triple F school? He said, well, you failed the state exam 3 years in a row, you're triple F. I said, well, what happens if you fail again? He said, well, we will fail again, because 80% of our kids don't speak English, haven't been in the country long enough to pass an exam in English, and this time the state says they'll take us over. I said, are you worried about being taken over? He said, well, I'm quitting at the end of this year, so I'm not worried. But everybody I spoke to described him as dedicated, committed, but he was tired. Tired of being asked to do a lot with very few resources. He said, the crazy thing is, if the state takes us over, do you think they'll know what to do? Do you think they've been holding back on some recipe for these kids that they will now make available to the children at Edison High School? At some point, we've got to acknowledge that what we've been doing doesn't work. Right? What's the definition of insanity? To keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And let me say this. As a former charter school authorizer for the state of New York, I was a trustee for the State University of New York. We authorized charter schools, some of the best charter schools in the country. If you think that just creating more charter schools is going to solve this, then I think you're, again, not looking at the evidence. Because you look at the cities that have done it. New Orleans, D.C., Detroit, where most of the schools are now charter, and you don't find high levels of success throughout the city. You'll find some charters that are doing quite well, and you'll find others that are not. And guess which ones are not? The ones serving the neediest kids. So it still comes back to the same issue that we haven't been willing to address. Poverty is an educational issue. And that's not because poor kids can't learn. Poverty is not a learning disability. But when the needs of poor children are ignored, when the support is not provided, they don't thrive. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because I would say that the needs are not simply hunger, although that's a need, or housing, or health. We have lots of kids right now who can't read. You know why they can't read? Because they need eyeglasses. And we don't have a plan to get eyeglasses to kids who need them. Right? It's that basic in some cases. Okay. But beyond that, we have social and emotional needs that we've only just begun to recognize. There's a very important lawsuit in California filed in Compton, saying that trauma should be recognized as a disability. And it's an important case because we recognize trauma as a disability in veterans. We call it post-traumatic stress. The difference is for children, it's not post-traumatic, it's chronic, it's ongoing. And the fear is that if you recognize it in Compton, oh, then you're going to have to recognize it everywhere. And guess what? The research is already there. Lots of our kids are experiencing trauma. There was a study done by my colleagues at NYU comparing children in Detroit to returning veterans from the Ohio National Guard, and on several indicators, the children of Detroit experienced more trauma than returning veterans. So we've got a lot to deal with. And I don't think as a nation we've come to terms with it. And so consequently, we see lots of schools failing. And we have not paid attention to the issues I think matter most. Now, one of those issues, and that's the issue I want to talk about today, is teaching and learning, which surprisingly has not been one of the issues we focus on. We focus on gimmicks. Right? We think, well, let's get more technology. Let's get iPads to everybody. Right? Let's restructure the school. Right? Let's add 20 minutes onto the day. I mean, literally, these are debates that are going on across America today. Someone called me about Chicago where they were debating whether or not to lengthen the school day. I said, you know what? More of a bad thing is never a good thing. Okay? So unless you improve the day, lengthening the day is not going to make a difference. Right? So we haven't focused on teaching and learning. The evidence shows. And we haven't focused particularly on making sure that all kids are challenged and provided the opportunity to learn in schools. Now that seems odd given that we've been doing reform for how long? Since Sputnik, right? How did we miss teaching and learning? Well, we miss teaching and learning because the classroom is in many ways the hardest thing to penetrate. Right? And if you don't provide proper guidance to teachers on how to provide support to kids, what ends up happening is not only do kids fail, teachers quit. And across the country right now, we're having trouble recruiting teachers. Right here in Atlanta. I hope they're here today. Because my nephew is teaching here. And he's a bright, young math teacher, just got out of Syracuse. The kind of person you would want. You would think, wow, how many African-American math teachers have you got? And I'll tell you, he's going to probably quit at the end of this year. Because education is one of the few professions where we intentionally put the least experienced people in the most difficult jobs. We don't do that to pilots. We don't do that to doctors. We don't do that to electricians. We do it to teachers. And then we wonder why that 22-year-old who came in so idealistic, after the end of the year, looks like they're 52 years old and doesn't want to teach anymore. That same nephew of mine saw one of his colleagues punched in the face by a student. And then she left. And he was so distraught. And then he said, you know, the kid who punched her is bipolar and on no medication. We got to do better. So we've got to recognize that equity's got to be central to our work, and improving the quality of instruction has got to be right at the forefront of our efforts. What does that mean? It means giving kids the opportunity to utilize their higher order thinking skills. The ability to analyze information, to evaluate, to apply it, to engage in some creativity, to undertake and learn through complex tasks and challenging text, to acquire the skills needed for college. Do independent research, critical thinking, and to produce high-quality work that serves as evidence of mastery. Why is this? This is an equity issue. Because in many districts, the only kids who get to do this are the kids we think are at honors or advanced. And you know what? The kids come to us naturally curious. What's the most common question you get from any 3-year-old? They want to know, don't they? They're naturally curious. They're curious about the world, but for many of them, the longer they're in school, the less curious they become, the less interested they become. And a lot of it is because of how we teach and what we have kids doing. It's an equity issue because too often we've used assessments to rationalize how we sort kids. We track them based on some measure of ability, which often means resegregating them based on race or socioeconomic status or both. We have dumbed down the curriculum to teach testable skills. Right? So we're boring these kids, particularly ones we think aren't college material. We confuse academic performance with intellectual ability. How many of you know kids that are smarter than it shows? I know them. I got a couple of them at home, right? Okay. Okay. There's a gap between ability and performance. How do we close that gap? And most importantly, we haven't given teachers guidance on how to do this work, how to meet the needs of a variety of learners. And blaming teachers is not a strategy that's going to get us where we need to be. I can't tell you how often I will go to schools that are struggling and they can't even find teachers to work in those schools. And so we've got to approach this differently. And that means, in my opinion, that we've got to start taking equity seriously. Now, you would say that many of our policies seem to take equity serious. No child left behind. That sounds pretty serious, right? Except we left lots of children behind. Right? Why? Because we didn't address all their needs. We pretended that you could address the academic needs while ignoring the other needs. Now, the ironic thing is that slogan, "Leave no child behind," you know where it came from? It came from the Children's Defense Fund. But when Marian Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, "Leave no child behind," it didn't mean test the kids as often as you can. Right? It literally meant you have to think about health and nutrition and welfare in addition to education. So if you're confused about equity, I would say anybody with more than one child already practices equity. I have 5, so I'm an equity expert. And one of the things I know as a father of 5 kids is they're all different. Right? Different personalities, different temperaments. My first son walked at 9 months. I was so proud, as if I had something to do with it. Right? The 4th one didn't walk till 15 months. I was so concerned. I thought she'd crawl forever. They're all walking around fine now. Right? Okay. They're different, aren't they? And some kids need more time. Some kids need more attention. Some kids need more support. Some kids need to be left alone. And so part of what we've done is we haven't really implemented an equity agenda in our schools. And so consequently, we see the kids with the greatest needs are the kids least likely to excel. Most of the time. And again, there are schools where that's not the case. And that's what we should be learning from. What are they doing differently? So I'm going to shine a light on those schools. Equity is not about, you've got to be still focused on the outcomes. But which outcomes matter? Well, think like a parent again. Which outcomes matter for you, for your children? Is it simply their grades or their scores? If our kids get high test scores but rob banks, we failed. If they get high scores but get strung out on drugs, we have a problem. Success is not simply about achievement, it's about development. Their development as adults. And so I want to be clear, equity is not about lowering standards. Can't be about making it easier for kids. Can't also be an issue for only schools serving poor kids or kids of color. There are a lot of equity issues in schools for affluent white children. Which kids are most likely to be depressed and experience social anxiety? Affluent white children. Okay. Which kids most likely to commit suicide? Affluent white children. Have eating disorders. We got to see the whole child, right? And recognize that their academic needs are interrelated with their social, their emotional, their physical needs. It also can't be about choosing which kids to serve. Like I said, I have 5. I can't favor one over the other. I want them all to be successful. I love them all. And so when you see districts that get caught up in a battle over which kids to serve, you know that they are always going to end up not serving the ones with the greatest needs because they don't have the advocates. Right? Their parents aren't at the board meetings making demands. So again, pervasive inequality in our society makes equity difficult. I think we have to acknowledge it. We have to acknowledge that when there are high rates of homelessness in a community, that's going to impact outcomes for kids. When there's high unemployment, it impacts outcomes. Right? The data shows it. And so we've got to address the out-of-school factors. We've got to make sure that our policies begin to compensate for the inequity in funding, because we are one of few countries that deliberately spends more money on wealthy children than poor children. The Canadians don't do it that way. And guess what? They get much better performance than we do. Equity in resources matters. We will never compensate for poverty entirely. So I'll be realistic about this. But if a child needs access to a social worker, we better make sure there's a social worker in the schools. Otherwise, we should just say, guess what? We're not going to serve those kids because we're going to expect the teacher to be the social worker. And they're not trained to do so. And so when we start to acknowledge that there are these other factors, as well as school-based factors that are contributing to inequity, it shifts the focus of policy. It shifts it because we have to start to realize that if we're going to ensure that the opportunity to learn is available for all children, we're going to have to do things differently. And so what the data shows right now is that for the most part, what our schools do is reproduce patterns of privilege and inequality. That's what they do. This achievement gap that we say that we've been so focused on, that is simply the educational manifestation of inequality. That's what it is. The strongest predictor for how well our children do in school is family income. And when you combine family income with how much education the parents had, particularly the mother, because the mother's usually the first teacher, you can predict with great consistency how well children will do. But I'll tell you this, I will bet in this room, there are people here. How many of you have parents that did not go to college? Okay. How many parents have any parents that did not graduate high school? Okay. Those of us who raise our hands are living proof. Your background should not determine what you can accomplish when you have access to education. Now think about your schools in your state and ask yourself, how common is it to see kids whose parents don't have much money and don't have much education who are excelling? And if the answer is not much, then we have to reflect and ask, what have we done? Because for many of our kids, education is their pipeline to opportunity. And we have to ask, is that pipeline open and available? So what we know is that for a lot of kids, the alienation starts early, real early. Kid has trouble with reading, so now they don't like reading. We put them in a slow reading group with a nice slow teacher. And now they don't like school much. By the time they turn middle and high school, they stop going very often. So they drop out. And before we know it, we have them unemployed or incarcerated. Who do we incarcerate? Disproportionately those we fail to educate. Think about how crazy it is. We are spending public dollars to incarcerate people when if we had intervened earlier, we could have changed the whole trajectory. LA County, we spent $235,000 a year on a juvenile who's incarcerated. We spend less than $10,000 a year in the public schools. We're investing at the wrong end. And so if we're going to change that, we've got to focus much more on child development than we do right now. And what do we know about child development? Well, we know a whole lot. We know that the social, the psychological, and emotional, environmental factors all impact student outcomes. And we know that if we provide services in a coordinated manner, schools have a much greater chance of being successful. So how do we know that? Well, we have proof. Proof, well, here's one example. Many of us know about now, it's the Harlem Children's Zone. Gets a lot of attention, it should. Jeffrey Canada's been at it for over 25 years. They serve over 12,000 kids in central Harlem, some of the poorest kids in the country. They start at birth all the way through college. They not only focus on academics, they focus on health, they focus on music, they focus on advising and mentoring and summer jobs. And the results are impressive. About 8 years ago, I was on a panel with Jeff Canada and Arnie Duncan before he was named secretary. And Arnie and Jeff was describing the work they were doing in the Children's Zone. And I asked him, I said, is there evidence that what you're doing will impact test scores? He said, I reject the question. I said, why? He said, because we never asked that question of middle-class kids. We never asked if we fix their teeth, will it raise their scores? Or if they get to play violin, will it raise their scores? We just let them play violin and fix their teeth anyway. So why do we have to ask the question of poor kids? So I turned to Arnie, I said, Arnie, what do you think? Is he going to need evidence? He was caught off guard, and he said, I think so. Because that's the nature of the business we're in right now. Now, it's kind of crazy that we need evidence that fixing their teeth or getting them eyeglasses is a good idea. But we actually do have evidence that it works. That is that when you respond to the needs of the whole child, it improves academic outcomes. And there are other proof points. Go to Vancouver, Washington. You'll find a high-performing district with high poverty. And a district leader, superintendent of the year, Steve Webb, who has coordinated those services in a comprehensive manner and made social and emotional learning a priority for the entire system. And you can also go to Massachusetts. Anybody here from Massachusetts today? Okay, now, Brockton, the largest high school in the state, over 4,200 kids, one of 2 urban high schools, gets a level 1 rating by the state. Now, I've been told recently, not doing as well. I contacted Sue Satchowitz, the former principal. I said, what happened, Sue? She said, changes in leadership, which shows you how fragile success is. Because Brockton High had been on a path of success for almost 20 years. 1998, it was called one of the worst high schools in the state. Boston Globe said it was a cesspool because of scandals involving adults. They projected that 75% of the kids would fail the state exam. So a group of veteran teachers went to the principal and said, the only way our kids can pass this exam is if every teacher becomes a teacher of literacy. Across the curriculum. Superintendent said, good idea, but I can't make the teachers do it. There's a heavily unionized district, so you don't have to make them. We'll start with who's willing, and we'll build from there. Said, but I can't pay you. Said, we'll work on our own. And they started in 1998. By 2002, 50% of the kids were passing. They said, it works. Let's stick with it. By 2006, 80% of the kids were passing. Since 2010, 90% of the kids passed the state exam, the most rigorous exam in the country. Over 1/3 of the senior class qualifies for the Adams Scholarship, free scholarship at any public university in the state. And guess what? The demographics of the kids who take the exam match the demographics of the school. Now, if you don't believe in Brockton High, go to Worcester Tech and you'll see the same thing. And that principal is Principal of the Year for the United States. Success is around us. We don't learn from success. What did they do in Brockton? They started with shared leadership. When Sue Satchowitz, the principal, announced she was retiring a couple years ago, she called me. She said, Pedro, I'm leaving. You'd like to send people to visit. They're not going to find me. I live in Florida now. I said, well, you worried about the school? She said, not at all, because the teachers own this work, not me. And after she left, the progress is sustained until recent changes. They had buy-in, but it took time to get buy-in. Teachers didn't all get on board right away. Those math teachers said, we don't do literacy. The PE teacher said, I definitely don't do literacy. But now they all do it. Right? Because it made sense, and success breeds buy-in. They had a coherent strategy focused on the students' needs. They didn't sit around blaming the middle school or blaming the parents, because blame is not a strategy. They said, what do the kids need? They said, you know, test prep is not going to get the kids to pass the test. Right? That's what they did in Boston, in Springfield, in Holyoke. They're still doing test prep. Brockton said, no, we have to teach the kids. Right? You have to actually teach the kids so they'll be prepared. They differentiated professional development for teachers because not all teachers need the same things. Right? Just so we want to differentiate support for kids, you got to do the same for teachers. And they looked at the evidence. And they stuck with it, and they tweaked it to make sure they were getting it right. And so when you look at examples like these, then you start to realize, well, maybe there are ways to mitigate the effects of poverty. Maybe there are ways to create conditions where all kinds of kids can be successful. Now, I don't believe in Lake Wobegon, right? I know you all know about Lake Wobegon, right? Where all men are strong, all women are good. Oh, you're all from Wisconsin, so you know. Minnesota. It's in Minnesota. Okay. Sorry about that. So I know it's a mythical place, Lake Wobegon. It's not real. But we should be able, if we focus on creating the right conditions, we should be able to create schools where it's no longer predictable which kids will excel. That's what I saw at Hollenbeck Middle School in Los Angeles. Right? This is a school in East Los Angeles. These kids are all immigrants, English learners. These kids are poor. Parents are factory workers, custodians, gangs in the neighborhood. This is an 8th grade algebra class. Algebra is the gateway to college. Right? And the teacher's so good she can stand in the back and talk to me. Because she's created an environment where kids are learning from each other. You know why that's important? Well, for one, it means they're not just learning math. They're learning how to work together. You know, it's a real skill to learn how to work with people you don't like. How many of you know people that don't have that skill, right? Okay. Right. And because they're learning how to work together, she can provide differentiated support to the kids. She's moving amongst them. She's the facilitator of learning. And I like to point out to people, this is the highest form of classroom management. Right? Why? Because the kids are engaged. It's not about behavior control, it's about academic engagement. In fact, they were so busy working that when the bell rang, they were disturbed. They didn't pack up 10 minutes early. Now, she has help. There's my 19-year-old son in khaki pants. He's with City Year in the class. Now, he's 19 years old. How much help could he be, right? But he told me, he said, Daddy, I taught a boy how to read at this school. I said, you taught a boy how to read? What do you know about teaching reading? He said, nothing. He said, but I played basketball with him every day. He had no friends. And now, because I befriended him, he was willing to work with me. He took off quickly. It was the isolation that was keeping him from learning. Right? So if you could do that in East LA, and I should say that these kids are lucky because right across the street is Roosevelt High School. Roosevelt High School is where Jaime Escalante taught. If you haven't seen the movie, go watch it. Stand and Deliver. It's true. Because you can go to Roosevelt and you'll see the mural on the walls. 19 years in a row, he got kids to take and pass advanced placement calculus. Now, how did he do that? Well, part of it was because he didn't know any better. He was a crazy Bolivian engineer. Right? And when he got to the school to teach math, they said, not these kids. They can't do calculus. He said, watch me. And as he started teaching these kids calculus, of course, and they passed, they assumed he had to have cheated. So they sent in the investigators, and they required the kids to be retested, and they passed again and again. So then they sent in the researchers. Say, okay, what's he doing? And the researchers came back and said, it's just math. Because they didn't understand what he called ganas. Right? He was teaching the desire to learn, getting kids to work hard. Angela Duckworth calls it grit. Right? He got kids to come in on Saturdays. He got them to stay late if they needed to. When he died 3 years ago, this great outpouring at his funeral of former students, many of them now professionals, came out to say one teacher changed their life. I met one of his former students. He's a superintendent now. He said he was there for us. He should take us to aeronautical labs to show us. He said, this is why you need calculus, so you can get jobs like these. He said, you're the descendants of people who built pyramids. Calculus is in your heritage. He had to break the stereotypes. He said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your games? He said, yeah, but not to cheer me on. He used to stand on the sidelines and tell me I stink at soccer, go back to math. So if one teacher can do that, wow, what would happen if we got a whole school full of teachers with those kind of commitments? And we started focusing, instead of focusing on achievement, we started focusing on engagement. That's part of the problem, isn't it? We've asked teachers to focus on the wrong thing. Raise the test scores. That's like trying to lose weight by getting a good scale, right? I think if I weigh myself often enough, maybe it'll go down, right? But you forgot all about the diet and the exercise that had to go along with it. Right? The pathway to achievement is through engagement. I have never seen achievement go up when kids are bored and alienated and disengaged. Never seen it happen. What are you doing to get kids excited about learning? That was what was happening at Hollenbeck. And they recognized that engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral. Kids are prepared, they're on task, but it's also cognitive. Right? They're asking questions. They understand what they don't understand. And it is emotional. They care. They work hard. They try. You know what happens when you put all this together? You see kids improve. Right? And that's what the evidence shows. That when we get schools focused on engagement, it gives them clarity about how to get kids engaged, performance goes up. And I'm seeing this now in lots of schools. I'm seeing it right now in juvenile corrections in LA County because they've adopted project-based learning. And I'm meeting kids who say that for the first time they're learning. I said, wow, you had to go to jail to learn. They said, yeah, too bad, isn't it? Costly. We should make that happen in more schools. But for that to happen, we've got to get teachers focused on evidence of learning. That means they've got to make expectations clear. They've got to model and expose kids to high-quality work to let them know this is what it looks like when you do it well, when you do it right. We've got to constantly assess, right? Not to rank kids, but to diagnose learning needs. Right? We've got to learn about their interests to make the curriculum relevant and meaningful. We've got to give kids numerous opportunities to revise and resubmit the work, because no one does their best work on the first draft. The real learning is in the revision, and the real teaching is in the feedback. And when we start to change that, and we open up the environment so that kids can raise questions, because kids will tell you the truth. You go to any school, kids will tell you right now where they're learning and where they're not. A lot of adults are afraid to ask, because once you know, what do you do about it? What do you do? And the most powerful professional development I see going on in any school is bringing teachers together to analyze student work. Because when you bring teachers together to analyze student work, the connection between teaching and learning become clear, and it allows your better teachers to be a resource for your weaker teachers. And so the practices that are required to get better outcomes are indeed evident in the places that are getting them now. And I don't mean the affluent suburbs where the parents have done most of the work. Right? And I go to some districts and they say, oh yeah, our kids are excelling. They got everything they want and more. If they didn't excel, you would be in trouble. Right? But when I go to places where I see kids from families that are struggling to get by and those kids are excelling, then I know we've really added value, that we're really making a difference. And in those places, they're not simply focused on achievement, they're teaching the social and the emotional skills as well. They're focused on character. They're focusing on teaching kids to defer gratification and learn to collaborate and control your impulses. Because these kinds of skills are vital life skills. And if our kids don't have access to them, they're not going to be very successful in life, regardless of what their test scores were. And so I want to encourage you as state board members because you play an important role. You are the ones who get to ask the tough questions. You are the ones who get to be the advocates for public education. Move away from the culture of compliance, right, that characterizes most of education in America today. It's all about compliance with policies. Move towards capacity building. Right? That's what the highest performing district in North America has done for the last 20 years. That district is Toronto. Right? When a school is struggling, the Ministry of Education comes and says, how can we help? They don't threaten, they help. We have good research now on what it takes for schools to improve. University of Chicago has done the research studying school reform, and they've identified the 5 essential ingredients. And when these ingredients are in place, schools not only improve, they have sustained improvement. Coherent instructional guidance system. That means teachers are clear about what to teach. And to be coherent, they have to collaborate. Ongoing development of the professional capacity of the staff. Ongoing because the skills of the staff have to match the needs of the kids. And the universities do not produce master teachers. We have a great teacher ed program at UCLA. We produce great novices, not master teachers. Third, strong parent-school community ties, because parents matter. Parents are influencing over 50% of student achievement. What's the plan to get parents involved, get the community involved? And that involvement has to be based on trust and respect. Fourth, a student-centered learning climate. A place where collaboration is the norm, where the kids are engaged as learners and believe it's cool to be smart. And finally, shared leadership. Shared leadership because it's not just about the superintendent or the principal, it's about the teacher, the custodian, the receptionist, every member of the team aligned on a common vision. Is anybody shocked by that list? What's shocking is why isn't that guiding policy now? Why isn't this what we tell schools? Focus on this. Do more of this. It works. We have evidence to support it. And so I would say ultimately what it comes down to is we need a different vision, a more holistic vision. Teaching and learning's got to be at the center. That's our business. But we've got to recognize that some kids need extended learning opportunities, preschool, after school, safety, mentorship, critical for many kids if they don't have supportive families, nutrition, health, art, science. We've got to think about the whole child. My colleague, Howard Gardner, points out that it was common in this country for the longest time for every kindergarten teacher to have a piano and for the kindergarten teacher to know how to play it. How come music's one of the first things we cut? Is it because kids don't like music anymore? How many of you know kids that have memorized the lyrics to hundreds of songs? They still like music. You know what? Music is one of the last things that people with Alzheimer's forget. The music of their youth. Right? That's how powerful it is. Right? We need to make sure that in the name of higher achievement, we don't deny our kids opportunities that engage them and make school meaningful and worthwhile. I said already, you are doing work that often goes unrecognized, so I want to not add to your burdens, but I do want to say the goal of education has always been in America to promote equity. That was the vision Horace Mann promoted, that it would be the equalizer of opportunity. That's why we were the first country to create public schools. And we didn't do it because the federal government required it. It's still not mentioned in the Constitution. States took it up. Local communities took it up first. And so we need to keep that vision alive, because the future of our country will be determined by what happens in our schools. Thank you.